us to do something.
G'day and welcome to Pello Talk. I'm Dave Pello, and every now and then I get to do some interviews, and I'd like to do a whole lot more. And for those of you who are financially supporting the show, thank you. I appreciate that a whole lot. As soon as we increase that support significantly, we're going to be able to get other people, staff on board to help with the production and free me up to do more of the research and writing and talking with some of the thought leaders in not only our nation, but the wide world. And, one of the most important questions for me, if there's any mark I want to leave on this world when I'm gone and my time is done, when my options and availability for making a difference is finished, if there was only one thing I could change, it would be that my generation would end abortion. For me, this is the greatest injustice of multiple generations, not just our own. It beggars belief that anybody would pick anything else, especially when one of our previous prime ministers said the changing climate was the greatest moral dilemma of our time. We don't have a super huge nation, but when he said that, we were killing between 80 to 100,000 Australians per year, subsidised with taxpayer money. That certainly violates my conscience. In an industrial, hidden and discreet setting. I don't know how the climate can be even relevant morally when we are funding the industrialized slaughter of unborn living humans. But here's the important question. Is it an actual living human? Believe it or not, there's a whole bunch of people who aren't very clear on this, and some people who would rather we didn't know, even if they suspect the horrible truth. And so the science is something that we should be very, very open to and very embracing of. And so it was with a great deal of satisfaction that I came across the work of Dr. Steve Jacobs. His PhD doctoral thesis was essentially researching the question of what is the scientific consensus. Now, I've never been someone who thinks science is democratic. The number of people supporting a thesis doesn't prove the thesis. That has to stand or fall on its own based on the merits and observable evidence. But nevertheless, it is something that we can take some lead from. Let's have a look at this evidence. If a whole bunch of scientists are looking there, then we owe the question some sincere inquiry. What exactly are these people seeing that we may be disagreeing with? And so I don't think there's anything more important than to find out the truth on the question of, are we or are we not perpetrating the greatest human rights violation of a century? And so with no further ado, I would like to welcome to Pello Talk Dr. Steve Jacobs.
It's not enough to do nothing. It's time for us to do something.
Steve, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Dave.
Now, your doctoral thesis research was very exciting, and so were the conclusions, and maybe even heartbreaking at the same time. However, let's go back a whole bunch. Before you came up to doing your doctoral thesis, you had a question on your mind, and you've been, even before you started this thesis, you had been on a significant journey. Just share with me briefly. I think just before we started the show, you were saying your undergraduate degree was in psychology. Why did you start a psychology degree?
So it's kind of a funny beginning. Basically, I remember sitting down with the course catalog and deciding between accounting, which I'd shown some talent for in high school, and psychology, which I'd taken courses in and I found really interesting. And the prospect of taking 20 accounting classes wasn't too seductive. So what really interested me about psychology was the ability to combine that with philosophy classes and ethics courses. So at Northeastern Illinois University, I studied a sequence of ethics courses, and this is really where the seed was planted for my research on the abortion debate. So I had noticed that human rights was this prominent concept that for some reason wasn't used in the abortion debate. So even though I had this intuitive sense that pro-life people used what was functionally a human rights argument at the time in 2008, not many were using the language of human rights. I also noticed that personhood as a concept was used inclusively. So philosophers, ethicists, they used it to expand the category of human to non-human persons who are deserving of recognition, legal recognition. So at the time, there was an Argentinian court that had granted personhood to an orangutan. We were having these discussions about how robots or technology could be ascribed personhood. But I thought it was weird that fetuses were the one category where they were actually seen as human non-persons. So I didn't understand why this tool that was meant to be inclusive to extend humanity to non-human elements, why was this being used to dehumanize fetuses? So really, I just saw that there were some missing perspectives that I really wanted to explore and understand, and that's what started in my undergrad.
I actually published an article on the Good Source maybe a week or two ago because a river in New Zealand had recently been granted personhood.
Oh,
and the graphic for the article, I really love doing the artwork for a lot of the articles, but the graphic for the article had the river coming down the middle and then the Da Vinci illustrations of the fetus left and right.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And so we just had person with arrows pointing to the river, and not a person with arrows pointing to Da Vinci's drawings of the fetus. And it's very powerful, and surely it's a sign of the end of a civilization when it goes through those kind of logical contortions to justify perpetuating violation of human rights. You know, I am 100% on board with you. I haven't actually written an article yet on the well, actually, in the recent anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I actually did comment a little bit on that there, and I actually think that language is rather powerful. I think you're onto something because, and here's why I'm actually so interested in your research. And again, we're just on the same page here. Right. The preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that the following, all of these rights, all the items and articles that we're about to describe belong to all members of the human family.
That's right.
And so therefore, surely the important question is, who's a member of the human family?
And in Article 6, it says that everyone is deserving of recognition as persons under the law. So like you said, when you combine those two, I understand that philosophers would like to manipulate and, as you said, distort the concept of personhood. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights couldn't be any clearer that humans and persons are fungible entities that are fully deserving of legal rights.
Yeah, and look, there are other problems with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I'm just looking off screen right now because I'm looking for that article to see if I can bring it up. But the reality is that while there are other problems with it, this is the language they use.
Exactly.
And so if we can persuade them in their language, right, using their definitions
on their playing field, ostensibly, right? They're the one that's the language of the dominant group, right? And here, pro-life, we're trying to leverage that. You know, even though most pro-lifer or many pro-lifers are religious and they might see the Bible as their authority, they're willing to meet pro-choicers where they're at, and we're working with these human rights concepts. And unfortunately, because they deny the humanity of the fetus, they do not see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being applicable to fetal rights. Oh, look! Wow.
So there we go. Human rights aren't for humans. Grant Vandersea wrote this. It was a great article, and I just loved doing that artwork. Person, not a person. And that's just the insanity of this position. So you finished your degree in psychology, and then as we're talking with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you figured out that a framework for arguing legal language was going to be important, and you went on to study law.
Yeah.
Was that your master's?
The way our PhD program worked was you would do a master's as part of the PhD program. And then my law degree was actually at a separate institution. So I did my PhD at the University of Chicago, and then I did my law degree at Northwestern, which was, Northwestern's downtown, and then University of Chicago is a few miles outside of downtown. So,
and you did your PhD where?
At the University of Chicago.
And how did you come up with your idea, and how did you pitch that to your supervisor?
So that's interesting. So within my first year at the University of Chicago, I took a course on the qualitative methods in the social sciences, where basically for our course paper we had to propose a research study. And we needed to explore which methodological perspectives we would use, what kind of methods we would use to study this question. So when I proposed exploring how I could do my master's and eventually my dissertation on the abortion debate, my professor actually said, no, it's too controversial, you can't do it. And when I explained that the controversy was the very thing I was interested in studying, he still said, no, you can't do it. And I basically languished for a few years before I could find a professor who was willing to support my research. And it was only once I committed to going to law school, I took the LSAT and did everything and was accepted to Northwestern. And then I found a professor who was willing to support me. Now, this is kind of an interesting story. In terms of the actual study, asking biologists on when life begins, this started at Northwestern. I was taking a public persuasion class, one that taught us how to write speeches and deliver speeches. And I gave my first talk on abortion. And in the talk, I suggested that there was a consensus on when life begins based on my review of biological textbooks, medical school textbooks. And the professor after class actually wrote on my my paper, where is the source, next to my claim. And in that moment, I realized, oh yeah, if you want a source, I could go out and get the source. So what started, what he meant for evil, it ended up being for good, because he was trying to be snarky and undermine me, but all it did was plant the seed for me studying this question.
Academia.
Yeah.
Whatever you do, don't tell us the truth. It's its own little interview topic in itself, isn't it? Just how prejudiced, and I actually think that word is very powerful with a law insight. That prejudicial, before the evidence, we've already made up our mind.
That's right.
That kind of prejudice is just like, if you bring prejudice to the academy, the pursuit of knowledge, then how is that anything other than just a religion?
Right.
It's not in the least bit intellectually honest. It's a false religion, of course.
It's completely against the spirit of empiricism, which is something that we should be, working towards in academia. And sorry, go ahead.
So my first job out of school, just for the sake of license to demean and crack jokes about, was digging ditches as a plumber's apprentice. So for the plumbers who are watching, what is the spirit of empiricism? Explain that.
Basically that things are knowable, that things can be explored, that as empiricists, we should actually ask operational questions, things that we could study, that we could learn about, as opposed to, let's say, I don't know if I want to step on this hornet's nest, but let's just say critical race theory, and a lot of what we're seeing coming out of the humanities. One could argue it's fundamentally anti-empiricism, because now even I just saw Scientific America had a piece coming out suggesting that no hypothesis is falsifiable, going against the nature of falsifiability. And I mean, they're just going against the very nature of science, which is, posing a hypothesis, testing it, making sure that it's falsifiable, that you could actually.
And falsifiable means you can prove it's wrong?
Or disprove it, yeah.
or disprove it. Right. Yep. Great.
Because if I just make a claim that there's no way in which you could prove it wrong, well, what's the utility of that claim, right?
Yep. Okay, so you get asked, what's your source for claiming there's a consensus among biologists on the definition of life, and then you say, I'm going to go ahead and find that. Was it? How long did it take for you to jump from I don't have a source to that will be my doctoral dissertation?
Yeah, that's interesting. So at the same time, I was becoming a certified mediator. So while in law school, I took a series of courses and I became a trained mediator, figuring out how to sit down with, let's say, a plaintiff and a defendant, and figuring out how they can move forward amicably without having to avail themselves to the law by letting a judge rule in their case. So I used to go to small claims courts between, let's say, landlord and tenants. And we used to sit down and just have a discussion about how they could move forward amicably. So I used that methodology to study the abortion debate. And what I found was I actually conducted these mediations between pro-life and pro-choice law students. And I found that we couldn't move forward with a productive discussion without defining what a fetus was. Because when you think about it, it really is the bedrock of this debate. If it's true that a fetus is not a human, let's say it's true that life begins at birth, essentially pro-life people are just trying to force people to have children. They're not protecting life. They're not protecting humans. They just want to force women to have children. If it's true that a fetus is a human, then pro-choice people actually do not believe in universal human rights. And they believe only certain humans deserve rights, those who've already been born. So it's this really crucial question, and it explains why it's one that's of such debate, and why it's one that, if you go on Twitter or you go to any discussion on abortion, very few pro-choice people will either admit or stipulate to the fact that fetuses are humans, because it makes the case for legal abortion so much more difficult. If you give them their druthers, if you grant that it's not a human, it's an open and shut case. But if you can prove that a fetus is a human and that all humans are persons under, the UDHR or even under the U.S. Constitution, it just becomes an incredibly difficult case for them to make. And that's part of the reason why Roe v. Wade punted on this question and didn't even assert whether or not a fetus was a human, suggesting that they didn't need to resolve the difficult question on when life begins. So this was, it was his suggestion at the same time as me working as a mediator and realizing that I need to basically address what is the central factual dispute of the abortion debate. Obviously, with opinions, it's very difficult to convince people one way or another because they have different values or different sensitivities. But on a factual basis, everybody should be willing to admit the underlying science.
Yeah, correct. Now, I just want to play this clip, and if it doesn't work, I'll insert it later. But tell me, can you hear this sound, or shake your head if you can't? Okay, so I'm saying whether it's a tree or fungus or an animal, where there's cell replication and mitosis, growth and development, without intervention, isn't that the universal scientific definition of life, whether you found it on Mars or in a womb? And then she says, I don't think there is a universal scientific definition of life. So this is the question you're asking. And that, of course, was Dr. Leah Torres. And she is an abortion apologist, a very accomplished and high-profile one. She's a board-certified obstetrician gynecologist, and in the great investment of her medical biological education, they failed to address what's the definition of life. And of course, we can be very, very pedestrian about this. The plumber's apprentice can easily know that if you took what's in a womb and put it on Mars, there would be nobody equivocating about whether or not we discovered life on Mars. That's life.
Right.
Surely this is high school biology. However, you set about being a little bit more intellectually honest and objective. What was your methodology? I think the first thing you started with was asking average people who they thought was best qualified to answer the question.
That's right. So at the end of the day, it wouldn't make sense for me to just say, okay, biologists are the most qualified to answer this question, because I actually don't know that the majority of Americans would assent to the authority of biologists, right? So it could be just this intractable question that one side says we should be listening to religious leaders and the other side says we should listen to philosophers, and neither side cares about biologists, right? That was possible. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of empiricism, right? This is something that I would actually have to ask people and explore. So I had surveyed over 4,000 Americans online, and I found that over 80% selected biologists as the
Now, let me ask the important questions. How did you select them? Was the methodology for itself kind of prejudicing, or how random was the sample of people you asked that to?
Right. So this was a completely random sample on Amazon's MTurk. So it's called Mechanical Turk. Basically, it's this website where tons of researchers use it as a participant pool. You can target people by state, by age, by gender. I opened it up to anybody who was in America. Now, as is typically the case with MTurk, they were more likely to be non-religious, more likely to be liberal, Democrat. So overall, it was 80% selected biologists from a list that I posed based on Roe v. Wade. So in Roe v. Wade, when the court contemplated the question of when life begins, they had suggested that it wasn't even clear if it should be answered from a biological perspective, a philosophical perspective, a theological perspective, a legal perspective. So I presented them with a list of biologists, philosophers, religious leaders, Supreme Court justices, and voters. I saw that as representing the full gamut of which perspective this question should be answered from, right?
Sure.
So
let me just interject that it should be stated as fact, or my assertion is that Supreme Court justices are respectable but not authoritative. They have made really, really, really bad law in American history. And the perfect example, if we're going to take Roe v. Wade out of the options, would be the Dred Scott case, where the justices, in their finite wisdom, no sarcasm availed, in their very limited wisdom, they decided that the Constitution actually provided for the property of people as possessions, hearkening eerily to the Roe v. Wade decision. However, there was a black man who wanted his freedom, and essentially his owner took him to court, or took the state to court, which had attempted to free him, and the justices said the government nobody has the right to take your property off you, regarding then the man as property. Very, very bad law, which future courts overturned necessarily. And we recognized that the Supreme Court does not always get it right. And so this important question is there, that even the Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade saying we don't know who's qualified to do this was a demonstration of poor knowledge. And so you went to the people, a randomized survey, and over 80% of them had the consensus that biologists were most qualified.
that's right. And the pro-choice participants, those who supported abortion, they were actually more likely to select biologists than the pro-life participants. So
very interesting.
Pro-life participants, they had suggested religious leaders to be most qualified. But as for
I don't even agree with that. I can't relate to that as a Christian. Like I'm about as Bible believing as they get. But I still marry a love of science and natural law with my love of the Word of God. And I think, have you got any insights or suggestions, guesses as to why pro-choice people would prefer biologists, and pro-life people would prefer theologians.
So both preferred biologists. It was just that pro-choice people were even more likely to prefer them. And I personally,
Okay.
think a big aspect to this was from a strategic perspective, right? So it could be that the pro-life people were not confident that biologists would actually correctly state the biology.
Fascinating.
They felt that a religious leader would be more likely to recognize the sanctity of human life in affirming that a fetus is a human. But what I think what was most interesting was the fact that I had my advisor, I had many of my colleagues and peers suggesting that they thought pro-choice people would select philosophers because they know that from a philosophical...
Leotaras would.
Oh, right, because you can define it however you want, right?
She said to me over and over and over, let's not bring philosophy into this. And then over and over and over, she made it philosophical.
Oh, of course. And that's why I was interested how many were truly honest. And it was because I had decoupled the question of when life begins from the question of what is the nature of the question of when life begins. So when I followed it up by giving them an essay question, and I asked them, why did you select this person? And over 92% said they selected biologists because they were objective experts in the study of life. I mean, it's right there in the name in biology, right? So I basically was given my mandate to go forth and to ask biologists from a biological perspective, because, you know, the reason I asked the essay is also they could have technically said, it's not because it's a biological question, but because I believe biologists are moral and upstanding citizens who will be honest. But no, they targeted them because of their biological perspective.
Okay.
And that's what led me, when I posed the surveys to biologists, to ask very narrowly about their biological perspective on the question.
Right. Now, I think you used the words descriptive in your executive summary. Was it descriptive as opposed to normative?
That's correct.
Woohoo! I'm getting academic.
Wonderful. And this goes back to David Hume, a famous philosopher's is-ought distinction. So there's a difference between what something is and what something ought to be, right? So you could actually look at this question of when a human's life begins as the difference between the descriptive perspective, which is, what is this thing? Is it,
which is the nature of science. You are there to observe.
Yes.
And so, when people use the words science says, you know they've got an agenda, because science doesn't say anything.
That's
science. It's like an apple. It doesn't say anything. It just sits there, and you get to observe what it is, but there's no ought question or answer in the apple.
Exactly. Although you could use the is to bear on your question of ought, right? And I mean, I think that's in the very nature of human rights, is you have to know, is this thing a human in order to grant it human rights? And this would,
and that's why I wear this T-shirt. Is because this is the ought. This is what people try and give it a technical label. And I'm happy for you to call it a gumboot if that makes you happy.
Right.
Because that's not what we're talking about. This is what we're talking about. This is the is. And so if you're happy on killing who and what this obviously is, back to you.
Right. So with the is-ought, just quite simply, I think this is another area in which we'll say the bigger supporters of abortion rights, they seek to distract and confuse and conflate this discussion, when really it's just really simple. The reason why I asked biologists is I wanted an objective understanding of whether or not this fetus is a human or a non-human. You know, is it akin to my skin cells or my liver cells, that they are human in terms of the adjective? Or are they human in terms of the noun, where, you know, obviously your skin cells are qualitatively different from another human. That other human is an actual human organism. It is a human, the noun. It is not only human, the adjective.
And so what was the question that you asked biologists?
So I had actually presented them with 5 different questions because I needed to vary the question in terms of how explicit or implicitly it was framed. Because if you just come out to biologists and say, you know, is a fetus a human, that allows for enough of a signal that they might think this is a question related to abortion, and they would be more predisposed to answering strategically. Right. So let's say with Dr. Leah Torres, we have to be honest and say that she is predisposed to denying the humanity of a fetus. Full stop. Right. And that there's nothing interesting or mystical about that.
It's probably fair to say she's predisposed, but the reality is that she doesn't.
She vastly, I've had a lot of conversations with her, and there are times where like I'll finally be able to nail her down. And then she waffles back.
It's probably fair to say what she does is she ignores the question and goes, it doesn't matter.
And it's pretty difficult for somebody to ignore a question like that when I'm pressing them. And that's why I am ultimately able to. I've had her finally admit that it is a human and ostensibly that abortion is a form of homicide, a few different occasions. But then basically, once I speak to her again, it starts all over. And that's because
you got a photo screenshot that. And
oh, trust me, I have.
Quote it. So you would take you back to the questions. Had to sort out what their strategic, try and filter out their strategic inclinations.
That's exactly right, and that's because I'm trying to engage them as scientists, right? So I'm trying to put it in the most scientific.
Elicit their objectivity.
Possible. Yeah, right. And why even say human being? That injects enough ambiguity where it's like, well, it might be a human from a scientific perspective, but human being isn't a scientific term. So no, it's not a human being, but it is a human. So when I frame these questions, it really got to the heart of, from a biological perspective, is a mammalian zygote a member of that mammalian species, right? So that would have been one of the more abstract framings of the question. And then one of the more explicit ones would be, from a biological perspective, is a fetus a human? Is a human zygote, because it has human DNA and it's developing in the human life cycle, is that a human? And overwhelmingly, biologists were willing to affirm this frame that basically, it's not only the statement that a human zygote is a human at fertilization, but there's also the very logic, the basis for this contention is that the reason a human zygote is a human is because it has human DNA and it is developing in the human life cycle. So that applies for all humans, whether it's an Asian 70-year-old person or it's a 10-day-old embryo, based on the virtue that they have human DNA and they're developing in the human life cycle, they're a human.
Right.
Yeah.
So you say overwhelmingly, what percentage of biologists agree that each human life begins at fertilization?
So in my dissertation, I ended up publishing that 96% affirm that a human's life begins at fertilization. And this was using these 5 different framings of the question, because there were some who affirmed one item and not the other. In the strictest measure, when I looked at those who answered consistently on all 5 questions, as well as an essay question on when a human's life begins, I found that 97% answered consistently that it's a human, and only 3%, only 33 biologists consistently rejected those items and suggested that a fetus wasn't a human.
Wow. So what I then need to know is, how many biologists did you ask? What was their demographic randomization? And were they from any notable universities?
Right. So this was an interesting project for me. I actually spent over 500 hours going to the academic departments' websites So I had friends who suggested I could do, some kind of algorithm to try to crawl the web for the contact information. I felt like if I was going to engage these professors and ask them for minutes of their time, I should at least have the commitment to see their faces, find their email addresses, and address them personally. So I went through what ended up being over 1,500 universities around the world. I had gone to, Chinese university websites, and I'd have to translate their biology faculty web pages to be able to understand what their names were and how to address them in the emails. So I ended up with a list of over 60,000 biologists from practically every university you've ever heard of, everyone I could get my fingers on. And over 7,000 had responded in some way to the survey. And my ultimate finding was over 5,500 had either affirmed or rejected the view that a human's life begins at fertilization. So of those who had actually affirmed the view, Harvard, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, just every school you can imagine had a representative that had, participated in my survey. And
how many nations did the universities end up coming from?
So in terms of the birth, because there was all different ways of studying this, it was over 86 different countries. It was every continent represented. I didn't have as many scholars from Africa per se, but then I had, plenty from North America, from Australia, from China, from around the world. And not surprisingly, over 85% identified as pro-choice. I believe it was 92%.
That's pretty much the inclination of most academia these days, is left of center.
That's right. And in North America, 92% were Democrats. These were your typical left-leaning.
So if the deck was stacked, it was stacked against the finding that you may have preferred with your latent bias.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, if it was going to be a fair study where both sides are equally represented, it would have been very different. But even with that, clear bias from an ideological perspective, it was still overwhelming. And there,
so whatever bias you brought to the table, it was countered by the mix of those. So the sample that you had the clearly opposite bias to you.
Oh, absolutely. And I had so many biologists answer the survey and affirm that it's a human, and then send me a long email about how important abortion is, that this allowed them to have the career that they wanted if they hadn't personally had an abortion. And I had people calling me a zygote worshiper and saying that I was going to facilitate the end of the world because we're so overpopulated. And if abortion doesn't,
that old chestnut.
if it doesn't control population growth.
That's only centuries old, that one.
Right, yeah.
That's a prophecy that's been failing for a very long time. And hey, one day they'll get it right.
Right. Are you familiar with, I believe the book's name is Empty Planet, and they actually predict that we're going to peak at 8 billion within the next century, and then we're going to plummet down to 3 billion, and it's just going to continue to crater from there. I mean, that's
when was that published?
That was within the last couple of years.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, no, I'm not familiar with that one, but there was the one in the 60s. I can't remember his name. Sure, yeah. That was a big one. But then wasn't it Malthus, old philosopher Malthus, who first said we're going to overpopulate and everything's going to be terrible, and then the Industrial Revolution happened and everything was great.
And then we still had the neo-Malthusians in the 1960s pushing abortion, and that's actually what Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has suggested, that she always thought of the abortion debate as a matter of population control.
So desired outcomes as opposed to actual understanding and reading of law.
That's correct.
An activist by admission. Right. Not that we needed her to admit it. Awesome. Well, let's see. What have we covered? Yes. I am interested. You just touched on it a little bit. Some people who answered one way or the other, and then and then wrote an opinion on the abortion debate, which was great, not requested, but I guess a testament to the fact that their answers were very reliable, because they do affirm that life begins at fertilization. even while affirming a pro-abortion apologetic. So my question then is, how big and varied was the pushback to your thesis? You had the first supervisor say, no, you can't do this, too controversial. So then when you got permission to go out there, how much of a controversy did it create? How much did you cop any, I guess, consequences? Did you get in trouble for it? Was it just criticism in an echo chamber, or how fierce and severe was it?
So my study was shut down 5 different times while performing my study. So this was, I would send out emails to professors. Within a couple days, my university's ethics committee, which had already approved my study, would shut it down. And basically they had received such a pushback from many of the biologists who, let's just say, their ideological biases were activated when they were asked this question, this scientific, really simplistic question. And that was what was interesting, how many biologists, some would say, this is such an elementary question. We all know this answer. We've known it since the 1800s. You've practically wasted my time in even asking it. And then the other side makes it out to be that I'm pushing some agenda. You know, I've had people suggest that it seemed like the survey was written by a member of the KKK or Donald Trump. I mean, just the most absurd accusations coming from these very educated. I mean, if you're a professor in biology, we're looking at least 10 years in post high school education. I mean, these are very otherwise impressive people as scientists. And to see them being brought down by such a simple question, and I think it, you know, I talk about this in my dissertation and some of the pieces I've written, it really signals how motivated their reasoning is. That another way of framing it is they're basically thinking about abortion in such a way that protects their identity. And that's kind of what I was getting at with Dr. Torres. So you have to think about, if you admit that a fetus is a human, then you're admitting that abortion is a form of homicide. A
very confronting reality.
Oh, right. It's the killing of a human, right? So like I had suggested earlier, you know, when you say that 56 million humans are killed in abortion each year, if you have to recognize them as humans, then you have to recognize it as the most prolific form of death that we have. But if you deny the fetus as humanity, it's just clumps of cells being removed, and it's no different than removing tumors from humans. So basically what's going on for these people is, if they admit that a fetus is a human and abortion is a form of homicide, they're at risk of giving over to their conscience, of making that logical inference that abortion should be restricted, at least in some cases, which really risks their identity, because this is so wrapped up in one's identity as either a Democrat or as a liberal, because it really is the crown jewel of the left right now. I mean, there is no more sacred issue than abortion. I mean, there are Democrats who support all kinds of things, but there's practically no more pro-life Democrats. And we've actually seen this in America.
I've actually heard there's a significant number. I thought there was something like a third of the Democrat members party were essentially pro-life.
Right. So I'm talking in terms of elected representatives.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. So
I don't even know how you could be pro-life and a member of the Democrat Party with their platform. I guess blissful ignorance. I don't mean to be cynical or snide. I mean, they literally don't know what the Democrat platform is, and they just, you know, vote for Obama because he's black, or something equally shallow and willfully ignorant.
Well, there's also the matter of misrepresentation by the media, right? So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but there's a bit of an issue with bias in the media in America. I'm not sure if you've come across that. So even recently, there was a piece by the Washington Post, I'm not sure if you'd seen this, that they suggested that the Democratic platform actually supports pain-capable legislation and banning abortion after 20 weeks, which is the most absurd contention. And we've had a lot of pro-lifers push back on that and call for a retraction. And last I checked, Washington Post still hadn't done that. So it's even the matter of a lot of these pro-life Democrats, they might not be fully apprised of just how pro-abortion the Democrats are. Because, I mean, if you look at the Democratic Convention the other week, they didn't even talk about abortion. Whereas that was a rallying cry in the past, their victory has been so total that they feel there's just no use in showing just how radical it's been.
Is it that, or is it that they're that smug and confident with it, that their platform is so well known and established, or is it that it's become a bit of a liability? Is that wishful thinking on my part?
It is a liability. Sorry if I framed it in a confusing way, but that's the very reason, is that they have had their victory, so there really is no need for them to keep pushing. I mean, you look at Illinois, they basically eliminated all pro-life legislation over the last few decades. New York, Virginia, I mean, they're what they frame as their attempt to codify Roe, they're really removing any protections for fetuses and any.
See, I would have thought if there wasn't a mood amongst the population that was changing and becoming uncomfortable with the violation of human rights that is perpetuated by the likes of Planned Parenthood, then I would have thought if that wasn't the case, the ascendant sentiment, that the Democrats would come out and go, our rights are under attack. You have to donate and vote to us. And you're saying it didn't even get a mention. So I'm thinking that's a temperature, taking the temperature on the nation. They're like, we've got more to lose by mentioning this than to gain.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. I'm in complete agreement with that. I think that they know that if you look at polling, very few people support abortion that is taxpayer funded throughout pregnancy.
Conversely, Trump has looked at probably his polling. There's no probably about it. And he's come out hard trying to advertise in big flashing headlines. I mean, just in the most recent episode of one of our shows by a commentator called Lyle Shelton, he plays the speech from Donald Trump accepting the nomination of his party. And Donald Trump's speech is all about how extreme, how radical, how unmitigated a gross human rights violation the Democrat platform is when it comes to the topic of abortion. So he's clearly saying there's something in this nation which is going to favor pro-life and not pro-abortion politicians.
Right. I mean, not a single Democratic senator supported the Born Alive Protection Act, which basically provided for a 5-year sentence for anyone who doesn't report the denial of services to a newborn who survived an abortion. So Elizabeth Warren made this out to be something that was denying women's rights. This wasn't even about abortion. This was about what happens after an infant survives an abortion, and they push back against that. And that's what was so ludicrous about the Washington Post suggestion that somehow Democrats are very moderate on abortion and that they allow for restrictions after 20 weeks. They won't even allow for the protection of born alive infants. So
they're barely even moderate like Moloch.
Right. And Donald Trump, he absolutely is the most pro-life president. When we talked about human rights, what I like to hearken back to is his speech at the United Nations, when he basically pointed his finger at these global bureaucrats and told them that they have no right to tell sovereign nations that they don't have the right to protect prenatal life. And, you know, he spoke at the March for Life. I was there. It was a very
I'll have to come to that one day, one year.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And he's he recently suggested that he's going to do everything in his power to protect prenatal life. And even when you brought up Dred Scott, there was a Professor Pecknold, who recently suggested what's called the Lincoln Proposal, and he wants Donald Trump to follow in President Lincoln's footsteps, that President Lincoln actually issued, I believe it was passports to slaves at the time, going against the Dred Scott decision. So what Professor Pecknold is suggesting is that Donald Trump should declare prenatal humans, all fetuses, persons within the meaning of the 14th Amendment, and that this would be a huge boon for the pro-life movement. And I mean, I couldn't imagine anything I would want more. It would be a huge step forward, and I think it would cement his legacy as the defender of prenatal life that President Lincoln was for slaves. I think it could be a really important move, and I hope Donald Trump, that the pro-life movement continues pushing him and emboldening him to be the defender of unborn rights.
So the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, 1868, granted citizenship to, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States, end quote, which included former slaves recently freed. So obviously they wouldn't be born. Would you have to amend the amendment to say all persons conceived, or would you have to naturalize? Like, how do you make that work under the 14th Amendment?
Right. So the 14th Amendment, this is actually a big area of confusion for a lot of people. So the simplest question is this: do you think the 14th Amendment applies to immigrants or those who are in the country illegally?
Citizenship? I actually don't know I'm just doing a quick Google on it.
I don't mean to test you, but basically,
no, test me. This is fine. I like it. I love America. I love law.
It does apply. It applies
if it's about citizenship, I would say no.
So it actually doesn't require citizenship. It applies to all humans within the jurisdiction of the United States.
Okay.
The 14th Amendment.
So I didn't think it granted citizenship. Sorry.
Right.
I didn't think it required citizenship. I thought, well, what I'm reading here says it grants citizenship.
Right. So that's what I was saying. And I wasn't trying to imply that you were one who's confused, but in my discussions about the 14th Amendment, many are confused. When they read that, they believe that you need to be born and born in the United States to have the protection of the 14th Amendment, when clearly that isn't the case, because the 14th Amendment does apply to immigrants and to non-citizens. So
once they're naturalized?
That's not required either. So the 14th Amendment, and this, I actually wrote a law review article that'll be coming out for the Tennessee Law Review. And my argument is that...
Okay, so sorry, I don't think enough of my viewers know what the 14th Amendment is, and I'm just looking it up now. And it actually says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. There's ... So there must be more to that. So you're saying you just entered the United States and you're a citizen?
No, I'm sorry. My analysis has nothing to do with citizenship. It has to do with whether or not one can avail themselves of the protection of the 14th Amendment. So basically, if you read the 14th Amendment, it provides the guarantee of life, liberty to all humans within the jurisdiction of the United States.
That makes sense.
Now, others try to seize...
You have human rights, whether you're born here or not.
Exactly. And they try to seize on the language of person in the 14th Amendment. However, if you look back to those who ratified the 14th Amendment in the 19th century, and it's Senator Trumbull, Senator Jacob Howard, they're, in my piece, and another person who's written on this a lot is Josh Craddock. So he famously had...
I'd actually like you to send that to me, and I'll reprint that piece, because it'd be good to share that. So people watching this can then refer to it.
Oh, that'd be great. He had a piece come out for the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, where he also makes the case that prenatal humans are persons within the meaning of the 14th Amendment. But basically, contemporary senators in the 19th century, they made it clear that the 14th Amendment applies to all weak and helpless human beings. And then there's even been Supreme Court justices who've come out and said that people understood the 14th Amendment to apply to all humans. And even justices in Roe v. Wade, in subsequent cases, they said that if there is no fundamental and well-recognized difference between a fetus and a human, then not only could states not permit abortion, but they would be required to restrict abortion by the 14th Amendment. So basically what this whole debate comes down to is, if a fetus is a human, it is deserving of constitutional rights and constitutional protections. And then the second step would be, how do those rights compare to a pregnant woman's rights? And basically what has been put forth by Roe v. Wade. So it said that if personhood is established, that the case for abortion rights collapses. So based on the logic of Roe was essentially premised on the notion that fetuses weren't humans. They suggested themselves that if you could establish that a fetus is a human, that the case for abortion rights collapses. And that's another reason why, not only from a discursive perspective in terms of the debate, but from a legal perspective, if you could prove fetuses are humans, if the Supreme Court takes judicial notice of the scientific consensus on when life begins, really the debate is over. It is the case.
And that's then the question, because obviously, as your research shows, that conversation is well and truly finished. It takes a great deal of prejudice to ignore the observable, describable condition and process of when each human life begins.
Right. And there are many pro-choice people who do admit this. So this might be useful for
Roe v. Wade is anachronistic. It's done.
Absolutely.
There's cobwebs all over it.
That's really what my law review article is. I make the argument that you should actually see Roe v. Wade as a situational finding, a context-dependent finding that was based on the reality in 1973. And they said it themselves. They said they didn't know when life began based on the development of man's knowledge at that time. So they were willing to consider that we would one day determine that it was a human.
And an appropriate amount of humility, which would be good today.
Right. And so pro-choice people do admit this. Margaret Sanger, Alan Guttmacher. If you actually go to whendoeslifebegin.org, this is a website I put together with Illinois Right to Life. And there's over 100 sources on when life begins, from scientists, from pro-life people, from pro-choice people, from legal sources. And there are just dozens of pro-choice people who admit that a fetus is a human, that abortion is killing. But they then try to deny that either a fetus is a person, because they use like a philosophical perspective on what a person is, or they try to make the claim that a woman's right to her body is absolute, and that even if a fetus is a human person, it has no rights. But as I suggested, the Roe v. Wade had rejected that. They actually had considered that. They said that the attorneys for Roe and some briefs suggested that the right to abortion should be absolute. And they said with that, they do not agree. So one thing to look at is actually Germany. So Germany for decades.
I just want to pause on that.
Yes.
That's just profound that the justices said that. That should be what pro-human rights people are trumpeting whenever Roe v. Wade is brought up, is hang on. I want to highlight that in your article. I'm going to make that a heading paragraph.
Right.
This is what the justices said. They said there is no such thing as an absolute right. So if you want to claim Roe v. Wade, Roe v. Wade, Roe v. Wade all day long, well, 96% of biologists agree each human life begins at fertilization. That question, raised as relevant by Roe v. Wade, which you're now saying is something we should be listening to. Well, okay, let's listen to it.
Right.
That question's answered. Number two, there is no absolute right to abortion. And I think, and this is philosophy, not science, but I think the umbilical cord doesn't diminish the human rights.
No.
It actually enhances the duty of care.
Exactly. And I like your framing of duty of care. I think that's something very useful when people make the autonomy argument, when they suggest that a woman has an absolute right to bodily autonomy. One has to consider what happens when she has sex, when she creates a human. I mean, this is akin to a doctor consenting to perform in a surgery, and then in the middle of the surgery suggesting that he withdraws his consent. No court of law would allow for that, because
I'm not fond of arguments that make a window for the consent at sex, because it opens the window for the rape exception. And the human rights of the preborn living human
Yeah.
are not diminished by the circumstances of its conception.
Yeah.
I think that's fundamental to the inherent nature of human rights. They are inherent, not contextual.
Right. And with that, I end up pivoting to the notion of what if it is that you wake up in bed with an infant next to you? Do you have the right to walk away from that infant because you see yourself as having taken no action to induce the reliance of that infant on you? Or
Yep.
do you have a legal obligation to expend the minimal amount of effort to get it protected, to drop it off at a police station or
Yep.
give over custody to somebody else?
And if you were a 9-month walk away from any care,
Right.
you would still not be justified in saying it's assaulting me and I'm therefore going to kill it.
Yes.
That would just be ridiculous. Of
And
course, it's a drain on your resources
Right.
and your body, just like the child will be for the next 21 years to the father's
Yeah.
body with child support if he doesn't want it. But, that's your duty of care. This is humanity. This is the fundamental obligation that we have to each other.
Right.
This is what makes us human and not animals.
Exactly. And that's why I try not to get too much in the thought experiments because anytime you move it from what is a very clear-cut case, which is there being legal responsibilities. The other thing is, I mean, what I think is useful when you think about abortion is to just recognize that if it is a human, a homicide is the killing of a human by another human. In our law, there needs to be a justification for a homicide. That's the only way that a homicide can be legal is if there's an affirmative defense. In the case of abortion, what would be the affirmative defense?
Yep.
This person is literally killing another human being. This is not a matter of walking away from an infant. This is not a matter of having an intense surgery that safely removes the fetus so it could survive outside of the womb for as long as it wants. No, those doctors are intentionally going into the womb and causing the death of that fetus. So what would be the justification? And based on my analysis of the laws from the international community and throughout history, the only justification is self-defense. And that's why we have life of the mother exceptions. So while the pro-life movement pushes back on whether or not it's the case that there's ever a situation in which an abortion would be medically necessary to save a woman's life, there's a reason why laws today...
Well, and this is where we come down to the intent. If your intent is to save the life of the mother, then I argue that's no longer a direct abortion. If we need to modify the language to clarify the objection, it's the voluntary, elective, desired outcome of the death of the child. That is the problem.
But it's still a homicide. I think it's worth still calling out. Even if it is to save the life of the woman, it's a homicide. It's just a justifiable homicide because of the right to self-defense.
Legally, technically, fair. Probably not prosecutable in what I don't know if Americans have this saying, but in Australia we have the saying the pub test.
Okay, what's this?
That's if you're Americans call it the bar. If you're at the bar, the hotel, the pub in Australia, and you just ask anybody, and they what are they going to say without getting too complicated? Does it sound right, or does it sound like come on, mate, you're having a lend?
In America, we call that the smell test.
The sniff test, that's another one.
Sniff test, there you go.
So that would be that there. So I don't think the calling the necessary choice between the mother or the baby's life a justifiable homicide. It would be technically accurate, but it wouldn't pass muster.
I think part of my impetus is just the sensitivity to the fact that this is the killing of a human. I think we should never bristle from that fact. However,
and look, this is how I do pass the sniff test, and that is, what are you trying to do? If you're trying to save the mother, then try and save the child as well.
Sure.
And do everything you can to do that. And so in the case of preeclampsia, an abortion is not going to be an emergency solution.
No.
A cesarean is going to be an emergency solution.
Exactly.
So if you're trying to save the life of the mother, which is just about the most common circumstance, preeclampsia is the most common circumstance where you might need to consider terminating the pregnancy. You do that by delivering the baby, not by killing the baby.
Exactly. You wouldn't use an abortion method. You wouldn't use what are typically seen as the abortion methods for that.
Correct. And another perfect example of anti-abortion laws not being bad for women is the fact that anti-abortion strongly Catholic Ireland, until they legalized abortion, had a much better maternal mortality rate than pro-abortion America.
Interesting.
It just wasn't the case
Right.
that anti-abortion laws were adverse to the outcomes of maternal mortality.
Right.
For some reason, America is much lower than the developed nation average for maternal mortality.
Yeah, I typically look to our obesity rates. Others imply poverty, but I think what's driving a lot of that is our obesity rates.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's kind of like when I recently spoke with a law professor who's an expert on abortion laws about this, and she had said she had never heard this suggested. I think it's kind of the, no pun intended, the elephant in the room, that at the end of the day, when there's higher rates, and I'm not a thin guy myself, I'm just willing to call a thing, and when you have those higher obesity rates, it just causes pregnancy complications.
You play football?
Preeclampsia, back in the day, a little submission wrestling too. Yeah, I'm a bigger dude. So, and that's something that we just, I
yield.
No. There's a whole host of health issues that Americans face due to our diet. I mean, some have described us as overfed and malnourished. That, if you look at our diet and our carbs.
I think it wasn't too long ago. It might have been 10 years ago. I can remember Australia's average obesity was bigger than America's, so we're up there competing with you.
Yeah, as you.
However, our maternal mortality rate is maybe half America's.
Yeah.
I think we're 0.005%, and you guys are like 0.0012. Last time I looked up the data, which, by the way, is about the same risk as dying in a fatal car accident when you hop in the car, go around the corner, and buy some milk. So. Another thing that Leah tried to argue with me was that every pregnancy is a risk to the mother, and that's just statistically not true. Risk of stretch.
She says everyone is medically indicated. I mean, she suggests as long as there's a higher rate of dying in an abortion, in pregnancy and childbirth than abortion, she sees as every single abortion as medically necessary. Is what
logical contortionism, which would never pass a triage ethics exam. I mean, obviously, you don't kill something anyway. It's just beyond ridiculous, contemptible assertion. That is, it's not even attempting to be sincere. And
you have to look at the incentive. What reason does she have to be sincere? I mean, I think that we.
Well, I like to grant the benefit of the doubt, and the reason we had an hour-long interview was because I wasn't trying to embarrass her, and we were trying to just have a dialogue, and it wasn't about gotcha. It was let's test each other's ideas, and that was important, and I do that all the time. I think. Just to try and bring this home, because we're a bit over an hour now, and that's okay because it's a really great conversation. But
really enjoyed it.
I think there's only, I think anybody that is still pro-abortion after they acknowledge all the facts, that they acknowledge that they're killing a living human, if they assert that a woman's rights are absolute, a woman's autonomy is absolute, even at the mortal cost of somebody else's life, I think the reality is that's probably not something we can counter. We just have to acknowledge is an extreme and radical position that is anti-human rights. And then they're clearly not pro-human rights. At best, they could describe themselves euphemistically as pro-woman rights.
Right.
And that then needs to be clarified is at the cost of all others.
Yeah. I mean, based on the human rights calculation, there really is no way to defend elective abortion. I mean, this is akin to human sacrifice. Even if you believe that
100%.
one has the right to practice their religion, we all recognize that there's a hierarchy of rights such that you cannot kidnap another human to sacrifice them, claiming that your right to practice your religion is more important than their right to life. So the right to autonomy, the right to make medical decisions, these things are all secondary to the right to life of somebody else. And when I surveyed Americans, I actually found that they did say this. So even pro-choice people admitted that the right to life.
I hate using that term. I hate cooperating with their euphemisms. You're not pro-choice.
Oh, I know. Yeah.
When you're pro one choice, there is no choice. You're just pro-abortion.
That's a really fair pushback. I still have.
You feel you need to play nice with their language?
Well, when I was in my PhD program, I mean, that's one thing we didn't get to. The fact that not only was my study shut down 5 times, my advisor threatened to leave my project and said that I couldn't continue my study because he didn't want to sign off on a project that would produce data that members of the pro-life movement could use. So I literally had to shift advisors in the middle of a research project. And this was after I had to ask, several different professors to step up and support my research after he abandoned me. So you have no idea what the politics were, how difficult it was. I mean, I had to basically...
I'm happy to explore that a little bit more. We didn't really get into the full details of that. If you want to talk about that a bit more, 5 times you got cancelled, shut down.
Yeah, I mean, it was the case that I would sit in the room with my advisor who himself had made a name for himself defending female genital modification. So he's basically the father of cultural relativism, cultural pluralism is how he liked to frame it. And here I worked as his teaching assistant for 5 years. He knew what my priors were. When I started the project, I told him, I believe abortion is a human rights violation. I went through the calculus and he said, who says human rights even matter? Because he had written many pieces decrying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I said, that's my prior. I'm not saying that human rights is absolutely the way we should move forward, but it is the way that both sides agree on. So when I surveyed Americans, I asked them, do you believe in these principles of the Human Rights Declaration? And 97% said that they believe that all humans deserve the right to life. All humans are equally deserving of rights. So that is why that was the playing field I wanted to use. Like you had said, that's what pro-abortion people assent to. So he knew all of that. But once he saw how hot things were getting, once he was threatened himself. So I actually had professors write letters to him and suggest that he had done something unethical by even supporting my project. And unfortunately, the water got a little too hot for him, and that caused him to pressure me to give up on my project. He wanted me to stop collecting data when I was only 20% of the way done. When I had only had 1,000 respondents, he said, "You're not continuing." He even suggested that he would recommend that I not receive my PhD. I mean, there were biologists calling for me to be kicked out of my department, that my project wasn't deserving of a PhD. So there were just so much politics and so many things I had to do basically to survive in that world. And I mean, as a mediator, you can't really go about saying what is the most correct term when that would seem ideologically slanted, even though, let's be clear, that's what all of the news agencies do. So when you look at their style guides, they recommend that you call supporters of abortion rights advocates. And then when you describe pro-life people, you're supposed to call them abortion opponents, which I never thought made sense. Why don't we?
I'm happy with that. Well, I am anti-abortion.
No, you're a fetal rights advocate.
I'm just.
No, you don't think you're a human rights advocate?
I'm also a human rights advocate. I'm also anti-slavery because it's good for all of them. 100% nail me to the cross. I'm anti-abortion. I'm anti-homicide. I'm anti-mass murder.
Yeah,
I'm
no.
anti-female genital mutilation. I'm anti-rape.
Right,
I'm,
but that's very purposeful. They're trying to frame you in a negative way to make it seem like
I'm happy to wear it.
harsh. Well, there you go. But so
I'm happy to wear it. I'm anti-abortion.
Right.
Bring it on. And my
Abby
generation
Johnson
will make sure that there is no such thing as a pro-abortion candidate ever again. That you, try and.
No, I understand. Abby Johnson, when she gave her speech at the Republican National Convention, I think they had described her on the Chiron as an opponent of abortion rights. I understand that you are anti-abortion, but that framing makes it seem like somebody is a draconian, anti-human rights person.
Look, I actually think the right strategy here is to run towards that. Slingshot around the sun. Just absolutely, I'm anti-abortion rights. That's like being anti-slavery rights. Thank you very much. You've acknowledged my ethics, my morality, my humanity, and you've thank you 100%. And anybody who disagrees with me is pro-abortion rights. Are you kidding? Right. How embarrassing, how humiliating. Do you even sleep straight in bed at night? Like,
but when you get into the subtleties of persuasion, I mean, it's one of those things for those who aren't thinking very carefully.
This is a culture change thing.
You're against rights. And that's why, if you're going to be fair, what it should be is you support fetal rights and they support abortion rights. I mean, I think from a logical perspective, if you were truly trying to make it neutral, you would recognize that both sides are supporting rights. Both sides are human rights advocates. It's just, of course,
where you're 100% right is that I may not get the opportunity to correct the narrative or to balance the narrative. We'll only have their framing of it and the perception that people are left with. You are 100% right. And it is intended to be weaponized as a pejorative.
Indeed.
Yeah, and nevertheless, shows like this exist to say, let's change the culture. If we have to move a millimeter a day, let's start.
Right.
Let's start. Sorry, millimeter, 16th of an inch.
I know, right?
If we have to do that, great. Let's start. William Wilberforce took a whole generation to end slavery. This is not going to happen in an election cycle, but my generation will end abortion. That will happen. And I'm happy not happy, but satisfied if it takes the next generation to finish the job. But we're starting now.
And that's what matters, right, is that we win. So slavery was with us for thousands of years. Yes, the abolitionists, it didn't end quickly enough for them, but it ended. And while obviously it rises up in certain pockets, and it's probably the case that you can never eliminate any human behavior just because humans are so robust, they're so durable, they're so defiant. We could change our laws just like we did with slavery. I'm sure there were people who said you will never end slavery, that they were even more confident that we wouldn't end slavery than people today are confident that we wouldn't end abortion.
Yep. And there's a couple of questions I want to ask you. We're just going to keep going until you have to go to bed or something.
I'm fine. I'm happy to continue.
I might chop this up, or I might just leave it as a long one. But okay, so one of the questions I got to ask, and I don't know if there's a good time to ask it. We might just jump around a little bit now. When I quote the data, your very good, reliable data. 96% of biologists agree each human life begins at fertilization. A lot of people say, wow. A lot of people go, what do the other 4% believe?
That's right. So that's the funny thing. Essentially, they are answering from this motivated reasoning perspective, right? Those 4% are typically those who are either so cynical or so nihilistic that they know what's going on and they do not want to be counted amongst the consensus, right? And at the end of the day, if you've done enough survey research, you realize that there's a ceiling on any question. I don't know that I would get 96% to say the sky is blue. I mean, people misread questions. People are defiant. So, but in terms of the essay question, So what I wanted to do was get discrete data where they either affirmed or rejected a statement that represented the view that a human's life begins at fertilization. I also wanted to give them an open-ended essay question so I could get good qualitative data to understand why would somebody disagree. And what I saw most typically was they would conflate, they would confuse what is the phylogenetic question from the ontogenetic question, okay? So they would see it as, even though I'm asking, when does a human's life begin? They would confuse it and say, when did all life begin? So I actually had people responding to the question, from a biological perspective, when does a human's life begin? And they would say 5.7 billion years ago. I mean, so that's a clear confusion of when did all life begin and when does a human's life begin? And then
bless their hearts. Bless it. This
is oh, sorry. Go ahead.
You're Illinois?
Yeah, Chicago.
So where's that in the map? North, south, east, west?
Oh, that's Midwest. So basically,
Midwest.
Part of the country.
Beneath halfway, or mid?
I would say a little above halfway.
Oh, okay. Well, it's one of the southern statements I like, and I've made my own, is, oh, bless their hearts.
Bless their hearts, exactly. And I had some people say when the kids move out. They're just jokers, right? When the kids move out and the dog dies. When they thought they were being funny, right?
When I can travel.
Yeah, I had others say life never begins. It's one continuous chain. And it's like, yes, I understand what you're saying in terms of the perspective of life, that it's continued in one unbroken chain. But obviously, Dave did not exist 5 billion years ago. As a human being, as an organism, there was a point before you existed, right? Even if there was a point where your mother's egg and your father's sperm existed, you did not exist as a unitary organism until fertilization.
Yeah.
So I think
they're in the wrong department. They should be in the philosophical department.
Well, and they were just looking for any escape hatch, any release valve, so they wouldn't have to admit, because like I said, there's such psychological consequences to have to admit that a fetus is a human. And I really think what was going on was...
My heart actually breaks. When I was... my heart breaks for abortion providers and apologists.
Oh, sure.
For the day, as I met my first abortionist, at first my skin crawled.
Oh.
And then I, and there's zero credit to me. This is all praise to God. But then I was able to see them the way Jesus saw them. And I thought, there's a day coming where they're going to realize the guilt that has stained their lives. And my heart breaks for that day that could crush them. Yeah. And yeah, I just, and we've seen with so many former abortionists. And then I felt responsibility on me. The way I converse with this person could delay that day.
That's true.
And that puts blood on my hands. I need to hasten that day by while being a truth-loving, uncompromised witness. I still need to love them for who they are, not what they do. Yeah. And yeah, that's just that confronting truth, which is why I 100% believe why they contort philosophy and ethics and logic and biology, and as you said, look for that escape hatch from that reality.
And it's not only them; they've been taught in this way. So when I give a lot of pro talks, and I go around Illinois giving these training seminars, basically to help people have compassionate conversations with people in their family, in their friend group who have different beliefs about abortion. And what I tell them is, this is not an opportunity to prove how smart you are or to prove how wrong they are. That this is an opportunity to educate them, to provide them with a perspective or a set of facts that they either haven't been exposed to based on their experiences, or they haven't been able to understand and admit because of their own psychological costs to recognizing it. So when I talk to these people, I try to tell them that, you also shouldn't feel defensive. If an 8-year-old calls you a duty head, there's no reason you should feel threatened by that, right? Similarly, when you have somebody who unfortunately is not understanding the facts and they cannot recognize the science because the costs are too great, you shouldn't feel threatened when they try to insult you or they try to distract the conversation. You should just stick on the topic. And this is, for those who are Christians, in evangelism, they say, stay on the cross, right? Don't get distracted when they want to say, well, what about this sin? And what about this? And why does God do this? Stay on the cross. For the pro-life movement, I tell them, stay on the humanity of the fetus. They're going to do everything they can to move away from that realization, but you just need to stay on that. And you need to do so compassionately, because let's face it, most of these people who support abortion, they didn't understand that it was a human and it was a homicide, and then one day changed their mind for financial reasons. There wasn't a fracture in their personality. They were raised believing this. I mean, we have generations of people, even though in 1828, that was when it was first discovered that a fetus was a human at fertilization.
Really?
Yeah.
How did they discover that? Was that with microscopes or before?
Carl von Ernst Baer, I believe it was theoretical at first. So he had actually seen enough data that he was able to extrapolate from it and realize that we all started off as a zygote, that all mammalian organisms do. And then it was later confirmed with...
That would have been a lot of postmortems.
Yeah. So Dr. Alan Guttmacher, the namesake of the Guttmacher Institute, which is the research arm of Planned Parenthood, I believe in one of his quotes, he said, it's difficult to imagine a time when people didn't understand that a fetus was a human. I mean, there are just so many quotes from even abortion supporters who say that, like, this is so common knowledge. I mean, there's this great article, and I could send it to you, from 1970 in the Western Journal of Medicine. It was a California medicine journal, where it's abortion doctors, as the editor of this journal, contemplating how do they square the fact that abortion is killing, and we have not developed our ethics to support legal killing yet. So how do we wrestle with the notion, how do you support abortion in a populace that doesn't support legal killing? And what they say is it creates this, confusing of logic and this, they have a lot of artful language describing, what did they used, what was the one term? It was so interesting. But at any rate, they basically contemplate why people are misled on the humanity of fetuses, and they basically suggest that this is a necessary precondition for passing permissive abortion laws. That if everybody recognizes fetuses as humans and abortion as killing, there's no way you could legalize it, because we didn't have the legal concepts to allow for legal killing. So what did they do? They denied the humanity of fetuses and denied the homicidal nature of abortion.
God forgive them. They're just having this conversation. Is how do we distort reality so we can do wrong? Like, we know what we're doing is wrong. We know what we're doing is wrong, and how do we trick everybody to say it's okay? Sorry, it's my phone going.
And it might be cynical, but what they concluded was we cannot shift our ethics. We cannot undermine human rights. So what's the clear answer? We need to deny the humanity of fetuses. And they felt like they were confident enough they could do that. And sure enough, all it took was a Supreme Court decision. Because when you consider the fact that, and most people don't talk about this, but abortion was illegal in the United States from the 1860s to the 1960s. Every single state criminalized abortion other than for the life of the mother. And this was after Dr. Horatio Storer of the American Medical Association put together the Committee on Criminal Abortion. So it was actually our medical association that went state by state advocating for these restrictive abortion laws. So you have to consider, like, if you're in 1973 and you're like, wait, abortion is illegal throughout this country because it's the killing of a human, right? That's how they all understood it. But then Roe v. Wade says, well, actually, we don't know when a human's life begins. And now here we are less than 50 years later, and only 23% of supporters of abortion rights know that a human's life begins at fertilization.
Really? Where's that data come from? Because I've heard people in the pro-life movement in Australia say that they think the science argument is somewhat redundant, and everybody knows that life begins at fertilization. But you're saying only 23% of abortion supporters know that.
So let's start off with I'm going uphill with that in America too. So I have bosses, I have people who tell me, quite frankly, that they think that the science is unnecessary, that we already know it's a human. Everyone knows it's a human. So if you look at polling from Marist, so the Knights of Columbus, they've done these polls with Marist, and they have found that less than a quarter of pro-choice people recognize a fetus as a human, that over half suggest that the view that a human's life begins at fertilization is a philosophical or religious belief, not a scientific and objective fact. And the 23% data, that comes from me. So I had actually surveyed thousands of Americans, and I asked them, I even made it specific to biology. I said, from a biological perspective, when does a human's life begin? And they most frequently said viability in birth.
Can you write an article on that? Or if you have already, can you share it with me? I'd love to just publish that and just to say, hey, this is one of the places the argument is at. I won't presume it's where it's at, but this is an argument we still need to prosecute.
And that's what's so funny is I think people have been so long entrenched in the abortion debate that they feel like everybody knows it's a human. But you and I know this being on Twitter. No, it's not the case. We'll have one person say, everyone knows it's a human. And then the next person says, of course it's not a human, which is always a funny moment to see that contrast in the same conversation. Yes, I recently wrote a piece for Heterodox Academy, and this is kind of like a free-thinking academic arm that allows for more controversial research. And in it, I not only argue that this is a major issue in the abortion debate, based on my studies, it's actually the central issue. So I basically did a cause.
I've always thought so. I've always thought so.
Absolutely.
Surely, and I can't remember who said it. It might have been Equal Rights Institute, one of those guys. But I think somebody said, look, the abortion debate reduces to two possibilities. You're either anti-science or you're anti-human rights.
That's right. I think that's 100% right. And that's what I found is when I talk to people and I bring this scientific perspective, I either get them denying the science or I get them to ultimately say they don't believe in human rights. So I think that's right, spot on. And yeah, in that study, I actually looked at all of the different factors for what constitutes, a pro-life or a pro-choice belief. And I found that the main driver was their view on when life begins. So, put another way, if you have an atheist who recognizes a fetus as a human, they are more likely to support abortion restrictions than somebody who is a Catholic or a Christian who believes life begins at viability. So
this is another thing is that it's not a religious perspective. It's a human rights, ethical, scientific perspective. And there's plenty of people without a religious framework who are pro-life. I mean, you see them on Facebook. Feminists for life, pagans for life, atheists for life. And it's like
secular pro-life,
yeah.
But if you look at the data, Dave, if you look at other studies, they imply that the differences between pro-life and pro-choice people is driven by religiosity. So they think that it's just a matter of religion. They also think that it's actually because of sexism. They use these terrible sexism measures that aren't even addressing sexism. Basically, anyone who recognizes differences between men and women is a sexist. and they use that to suggest that's what is driving pro-life beliefs. They say that it's right-wing authoritarianism. They have all these strange, predictors. And I found in my study, I found the greatest causal explanation for differences between pro-life and pro-choice people, and it's their views on when a human's life begins.
So fascinating, so interesting. Look, let's wrap it up. I've really enjoyed chatting to you. We could probably go for another hour and a half, and maybe we should just do it again.
I would appreciate that.
This conversation just has to keep happening because, people aren't going back and watching the videos I did 2 years ago. As evergreen as they may be, we just have to keep talking about it. We have to keep this conversation in front of people's minds. You're a leader in your field. I think the work you've done is a watershed moment in the quest for the equal access to human rights for unborn people. And I'm really pleased to make your acquaintance face to face, as it were, continents apart. Would hopefully count you as a friend for decades to come and co-belligerent in this cause. Once you acknowledge the humanity of the unborn child, all of the filters and exclusions from this debate must fall away, just as it was everybody's obligation and imperative to fight for the equality of black people.
That's right.
It's our obligation and imperative to fight for the justice and equal rights of unborn people, preborn people. I don't like the word unborn. I like preborn.
Yeah, I think Dr. Torres has mocked that it almost sounds like they're zombies. And they're prenatal or preborn. And I mean, just to your point, 56 million humans are being killed under the auspices of abortion each year. That's over 1 billion since the year 2000. That's double what was estimated in all human wars in the last 6,000 years. It's less than 500 million are estimated to have died in war. And we're talking about abortion. In 20 years, we've killed double that. I mean, it is the most, as you've said, the most prolific human rights abuse, human rights violation the world's ever seen.
And speaking of another human rights violator, speaking of those kind of numbers, another human rights violator quoted, one human death is a tragedy. 1 million is a statistic. And of course, that was Joseph Stalin. And there's a fair equation between his death toll and the abortion industry, although the abortion industry probably embarrasses him for insufficiency. And look, that individual story is the one I just want to finish on this note of empathy and compassion for women who have in the past, or maybe even now, find themselves in a situation where they believe and sincerely feel there is no other choice. I can't relate to that. But just know that there is a lot of support for you that offers no judgment. If you need healing and counseling for the trauma suffered from a past abortion, my heart breaks for you, and I really want you to find that. If you reach out to me, I'm happy to point you to some people, but Google will definitely help you. Post-abortion trauma counseling. It will be free, it will be confidential, it will be qualified and competent, and they will help you without judgment. And if you're facing that kind of decision at the moment, please know you have more than one choice. And the right choice is the way God designed you. But more important than that is you don't have to make that choice alone. There is support for you that won't be coercive or pressuring. And it's super important that you reach out for help and allow people to be able to contact me, contact Steve, and we would be very happy to point you in the right direction if your search engine doesn't give you an easy, quick answer. But know that we're praying for you, because the evil enemy here is not the woman, not the mother, not even the abortionist. It's the industry and the idea, and we have to oppose and defeat that, so that the whole generation knows and promotes the equality, liberty, justice, and peace of all members of the human family.
Amen.
As the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says. Steve Jacobs, thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you and get in contact with you if they want to follow your work and keep up with you?
So they could follow me on Twitter. I think I'm at Dr. Steve Jacobs. If you go to whendoeslifebegin.org, it's just a fantastic resource where we don't only list the sources, we actually show you a screenshot of the original source. So you don't have to take our word for it that the source says a certain thing. You can actually see a screenshot of the website or a photo of the book that states that. So that's just a fantastic resource that I hope can take hold in the pro-life movement, that we can really start stomping out this opposition to the humanity of fetuses, because it's so well proven from the pro-abortion side, from the pro-life side, from the scientific and legal perspective. So I really think that's where most of our energy should go, that if we lived in a society where everyone recognized a fetus as a human, there would not be the support for abortion that there is today. It truly is artificially inflating support for abortion rights and artificially declining the support for fetal rights.
Yeah. Well, as we conclude the show, I want to do what I always do and thank the Good Source supporters, those people who have contributed financially to the ongoing research, production, and time it takes to bring you these conversations, write articles, and curate a website where these are a forever resource for you, for your information and education. If you would like to become a Good Source supporter, you're most welcome. That can start from whatever little amount you have each month. And of course, the more generous you are, then you're actually sponsoring and helping pay it forward for other people who can't afford to. You can become a Good Source supporter at goodsource.news/support. That's good, SAUCE.news. And we look forward to welcoming you there. In fact, this video is so long, what I'll probably do with it is put half an hour out there for broadcast and the long extended version available for members and those financial supporters. And that will be available for you at any level of financial support. So again, thank you to the Good Source supporters for helping this happen. And my guest today, Dr. Steve Jacobs. It's been fun, and we'll see you later.
Thanks so much, Dave.
Will we see an end to all this pain? Oh, it's not enough to do nothing. It's time for us to do something.